Good afternoon. Welcome back. I hope you are all on your sugar rush. um, we're it's important to be thoroughly caffeinated for this session before we turn to alcohol afterwards. At this point, we're really talking. If in many ways the discussion up until now has really been about trying to diagnose issues, to find patterns and problems. And what we really want to be able to do now is see, are there patterns in the solutions too? And do we see things that are really rising out? Do I really need the microphone? Oh, okay. All right. Then I will continue with the microphone. Yes. Okay. A little frightening, but fine. So what I'd like to do now is we have the rapporteurs from each one of the major segments. We're not going to go in order because one of our rapporteurs with her rapping is going to have to leave fairly soon to catch a train. But what I'd like to do is ask each of the rapporteurs maybe to think about kind of two topics. One is, in order to really maximize discussion, think about like a few of the key issues that you think are that are in common, and maybe that are or especially in your session that seem particularly different, that are particular to your subject, either whether it's a region or it's to an area like finance. And you don't have to be comprehensive in trying to capture all of the ideas and the flow of arguments, but kind of key points. And then the second is to try to think if there were one or two major conclusions. Maybe they weren't like raised by anyone in the room, but something that might be what you think of as an integral solution that would be important and useful. So with that, I'd really like to be able to turn first to Jennifer Fernando with the French Water Partnership, and if you could launch us off.
Thank you, John. So I was the reporter of the first panel. So so actually we can identify some barriers highlighted by the panelists. So I'm gonna try to give you some examples. So maybe the first one is that water and climate is still identified as two different fields and with two different languages and different narratives. So that complicate a lot the discussion between the two fields. The other example is water is seen as a sector, and but water should be promoted as a cross-cutting solution. So this is one of the second. This is the second barrier. What else? Water seems to be poorly addressed in NDCs. It's important to evaluate why. Is it because of lack of awareness about the potential opportunities from the water field, or is it an issue of not knowing the cost of inaction, for instance? So this is something that we have to think about. Maybe for a last example, it seems like there is not enough effort to translate the NDCs and NAPs into actions. Again, it's important to identify why and what are the main barriers. So that's, I think, that the main barriers that I could identify from the panel's discussion. I don't know if I continue with the some solutions. So there are many solutions proposed by the panelists. One of the solutions is that in fact, the general public and more especially the young generation is more and more aware of climate change and the related impact. However, they are not necessarily aware of the existing solutions. And I think it's very important to also include them into the discussion because they can be a powerful, powerful stakeholders in the discussion and will help to push a little bit the governments to take action. And probably this is something that we can work on, is to find the right message, maybe to adapt a little bit the communication strategy to try to maybe simplify the message, but to catch a message that can relate it to their basic life and for instance. So this is an option. A solution. Another solution is let's see. I have so many. So water should be promoted as a cross-cutting solutions. That means that we should change the way of thinking about water management by promoting more integrated approach. The panelists mentioned, for instance, forestry as a approach. In fact, there is many natural resources, so water, forest, lands, and we need to take into account the nexus between all those natural resources and the users. So this is something that can be for the message to the general public and the decision makers. And finally, probably it's I think it's a very interesting point, is in fact water is seen as a risk, and we have to probably try to change that message and try to push that water is also an opportunity. We see there are so many solutions from the water field, and I think it's something that we can try to promote. Thank you.
Excellent. That's a really good summary. I really liked the way that you were able to, I think, very concisely put a lot of pressure on this tension between water as a sector and as a cross-cutting element, that we need to both act within a sector at the same time that we're acting outside of a sector. Yeah. I think that's something that actually the water community is not that good at. And I think on the solutions side, I was really reminded that after the first Water Action Day in the Marrakesh COP.
So 2016.
Yes, that's right. So 2016, and I was sitting down with a couple of other people. I think you were there, Donnie, and there was a representative from the UNFCCC there, and he said, "What I want to see in your summary from the Water Action Day are two main messages. One is what can the water community do to help the climate community, and what can the climate community do to help the water community?" And that sense of interdependence. That we are solutions to each other's problems, I think, is something that, from especially a communication standpoint, and also a very practical standpoint, that we have not reached very much yet.
Yeah. And also, I think there is the different frameworks actually. So we have the Paris Agreement, but we also have like the 2030 agenda, and water is mentioned in the SDG 6, and we have climate mentioned in the SDG 13, and even in that framework, there's some gaps. So, for instance, on SDG 6, there is no mention about water risk. And in the SDGs, the disasters, basically. And on the SDGs 13, there is no mention about water. And so there are some gaps that have to be filled, and I think communication will help a lot. So there are different framework, and I think, and Wada is a sectorial and cross-cutting subject. So we have to try to promote water in the different frameworks and fields. So, and also for biodiversity, it's the same. There is another framework, and we have to continue to not to only target the Paris Agreement, but also to target other frameworks.
Excellent, thank you. Before she leaves, any last questions for Jennifer? A response or comment on her conclusions? All right. Well,
I still have a few minutes.
Okay, super. All right, then we'll excuse you when you need to go.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very happy that I could participate to this event.
All right, and from talking about climate and water into action, we turn to finance now. And Ingrid, we're ready to receive your pearls.
Well, they're not mine. I stole them from the speakers, thankfully. So in terms of kind of key issues that were discussed, Francois, he started by saying that kind of one of the main challenges for countries is actually in terms of getting or access to finances is, what is your climate story and what's the climate rationale? And that, I think, fed into a lot of the discussion that, as Daniela pointed out, we don't really need to talk about more funding. We need to talk about how it's used. And so, getting to issues of capacity building, and kind of having the correct enabling environment, I think, is really important. Something that was brought up by a few different people and by some of the participants as well is that, it really doesn't matter how much funding is out there, how much funding is available, if the governance aspects aren't taken care of, if there isn't capacity, if there aren't the correct institutions in place to actually both prepare projects, but also then implement them and learn from them, and then, ideally get additional financing. So I think that's kind of one of the main key issues. And then in terms of, I guess, let's see, you said solutions, right? Well, there were a lot of solutions, actually, and I think, one of the things that I didn't mention earlier was this discussion about kind of innovative finance, and one topic that did come up was blended finance solutions, but I think it was Alistair who mentioned that GCF still, most if not all of the applications are just strict grants still, and so this issue of co-financing and blended finance, it's something that's being worked on a lot by groups like the OECD, WRI, et cetera. So there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of solutions potentially there. Also, other kind of innovative funding mechanisms. John mentioned the Climate Bonds Institute, so green bonds started out slowly, and it is really accelerating now and taking off. So I think that's something that's really interesting to look at. And then also funding for different types of investments, so not just kind of traditional infrastructure and those sorts of things, but looking at the benefit and importance of ecosystems as well. So green infrastructure.
And a lot of those comments are really, so I would say that they're maybe more generic about good projects in general. They're not necessarily water projects and reflecting water knowledge. I think, what I was really struck by listening to Alistair in particular is that many of the projects that are coming into the GCF and probably a lot of other climate finance channels too, they're just not good projects. And that actually should have been handled maybe before. And we know how with the World Bank, the African Development Bank, we know how to do good projects. It's that water piece, and especially the resilient water piece, that this seems to be the real challenge in achieving this goal of quality.
And being able to effectively translate that into then the climate components and the climate language as well. And I mean, it's a two-way street, I think. And so making sure that climate story is front and center there. Yeah,
that's a nice phrase from Francois, and I think Alistair also was echoing that for the water community, we really need to get that climate piece right.
Right. And then throwing it back to the climate folks as well, recognizing that a lot of projects that maybe, wouldn't be considered a traditional water project, but have embedded water components into them, you need to be considering what are the water, availability and also demand, and what that might have an impact on in terms of projects.
Excellent. All right. I will now turn to Martin. If you could talk about your regional session.
Hello. Do I have to? Okay. Yes. Thank you, John. So I was attending the SIDS, Small Island Developing States Roundtable, and we had speakers from the Ministry of Planning of Trinidad and Tobago, Kishan, Trevor from the Ministry of Agriculture and Planning, and GWP Chair of Grenada. And we also included two more states which are not technically small island developing states, but we got some insights from them. It's Chile, represented by Alejandra, who's working also with the scientific community of COP25, and Mulu from the Ethiopian embassy. So what I'm going to say, it's true, especially for Trinidad and Tobago and for Grenada. Not necessarily for the other two countries, but I think in most cases even for them. So you ask about similarities. The challenges seem very similar. We have the challenge of old infrastructure, especially on the islands, and a lot of leakage combined with that old infrastructure and unaccounted for water. We have the issue of awareness raising, which was done for many years, but it remains very important and relevant in these countries. There is one issue which is really focused on small islands, and I learned that Grenada is smaller than Trinidad and Tobago. It's only one island, so and that's limited land resources. So when there is a disaster like a flooding, it's really a challenge to relocate the communities. And tourism is, I think, in all of the countries, a very important sector of the economy, and they need water, and they are one of the most important water consumers. Also, traditional methods like for water harvesting and for water treatment are widespread in all the countries which were present. And now comes climate change, or not only now, but even a couple of years ago it started. This means in the Caribbean, less total precipitation, so less water availability, but more extreme events. In a country like, I think it was Grenada, which had 95% surface water, this can really have an impact, obviously. So Kishan from Trinidad and Tobago added that climate change is now a security threat, or can be seen as a security threat, and it's a public message. And Trevor introduced the term climate-sensitive water tariffs in the same regard. So what are you going to do if there is a very serious drought? How do you work with the tariffs? Now a difference, Trinidad and Tobago has no adaptation component in its NDC. And I think it's one of the few developing countries which does not include in the NDC. Still, they're doing adaptation. For Grenada, adaptation and mitigation are both included, and water is a priority for both of them. And it's a challenge for these disaster-prone countries, especially the islands, to disentangle disaster risk from climate change. It's really difficult. Kishan had a good solution for that. If you do climate-wise, or if you focus on climate risks, you will focus on today's disasters. But I think it's also important to always check and recheck, and that he said we are doing monitoring and evaluation of these actions if they are still consistent with the long-term climate change as well. Also climate risk assessments are increasingly becoming standard, for example, for environmental impact assessments. And now to the solutions. Danny asked, what can we do to help you? So I got the solutions right away. And Lesha summarized them, so it's even easier. So one issue is data collection. I think it was Grenada which dealt with the climate risk insurance facility. Yes, okay. And it's just not easy to fulfill the standards. It seems to be complicated because a lot of data is required, and that's a thing where donors can really help for accessing the funds of these kinds of mechanisms. The second thing is technical assistance and knowledge transfer. It's not only about grants, big grants and large credits. It's also really about sending somebody really experienced to ministry or to public administration just for a couple of months. We learned that this can also help a lot, even though it might not have the same cost. But it seems to be very welcome. And the third thing is to build on the traditional methods which do exist for water storage or water treatment. Donors can really help to upgrade these systems. And I learned that gender equality in all 4 countries is really happening.
Excellent. I'm really struck in your diagnosis and problem side that many of the issues that you described are about existing within fairly narrow operating limits. That there's, if you extend a little bit beyond what a kind of normal steady state, then the system gets very stressed, and that often the size of the societies themselves can become a kind of risk, because there's maybe not much redundancy in terms of personnel, administrative function, other kinds of capacity that maybe a physically larger country might be able to have, or a more diversified economy might be able to have. Is that right?
Yes, true. And I also learned that Trinidad and Tobago or Grenada has, what was it, 70% young people. So it will, like the population itself can be a challenge, the size of the population.
Yes, exactly. That actually, I think, goes back to Jennifer's comment too, that often you see with younger people that there's almost an impatience and maybe even fear about climate change, and how do we maybe harness that into something that's more practical and programmatic and positive. That's about what we can do to help. I'm also really struck with the kinds of solutions that you described, that many of them were really about important external relationships that the people in these places they want to know, they want to learn, they want to be able to do it themselves, and they really need not long-term help. They need short-term transformative help. Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. So technical assistance is still there. GIZ is focusing on technical assistance, and it remains important, and we can learn from each other.
As long as the GIZ staff go for a short time, they don't shower too much, and then they go home again. Okay, excellent. All right, Yoshi, if you could talk to us about what you heard.
Okay. So thank you, John. So I was sitting with the people for the African roundtables, and we had 3 presentations from 3 countries, which are the Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, and Angola. We had also participants from risk sectors, where Jennifer was there, and also Global Water Practice, WRI, NGOs, and also the women sectors, and also IMI. So it's quite a comprehensive participant. And we discussed a lot of issues. Actually, some of them already covered, so I see quite similarities. But for the Africa, it's a big continent and continent of the development for next decades. So it's a big continent, and obviously linking to what Jennifer said about the sort of silos for the among different ministers. But actually, the water also goes beyond one countries. So NDC has a national agenda, but actually this sort of should be shared by the transboundary basins, because that some of the agenda should be targeted by countries in the riparian country in the one basins. There are big basins in the Africa Congo, Zambezi, and the Nile and the Lake Victorias, and there's sort of basin organizations for ZAMCONs and LBBCs and Nile Basin Initiative. And there's also AMCAO, that the African Minister of the Water Resources, who could potentially coordinate sort of NDC agenda, but a little bit upscaling towards basins and also the continent. So I think that's one mechanism that can potentially make it more efficient, sort of implementations of the NDCs. And another big issue that came up for for Africa is that so agriculture is expanding for many countries in the Africas. But so we focus on the climate change for agriculture, smart agricultures. Then we try to harvest more crops. But actually, there's also issue in the storage, that we harvest a lot of crop like a maize. There was example from the Zimbabwe that they harvested a lot of the maize, but because the climate change, so moistures and also temperatures is going up, so that they cannot store very long this maize, and they had to waste all the maize harvest, and which needs sort of some flexible financing to sort of support those type of storage. And how to maintain those harvest. That's very important issue for many countries in Africa where the agriculture is expanding. And another issue is that so hydropower tend to come up for the adaptation measure because it's a renewable energies and also less emissions. But at the same time, that there's also a discussion a lot for the sedimentation, siltations, which also reduce the sediment towards coastal areas, which also introduce coastal erosions and increase in the salinities. And obviously, this affects the agriculture for the soil salinities and also salinizing the groundwaters, which is also a big issue for coastal areas in Africa. Groundwater can be a huge potential for agriculture expansion. So I think have to have some sort of better management. And the gender issue also came up for the Africa. It's a very, very big issue for Africa too. Then also the capacity development for Africa is really urgent issues. So right now many countries outsourcing sort of project implementations and also water resource assessment. So it's not so much relying on the own capacity, but so it's not so much raising sort of younger sort of generations and experts, which needs sort of a long-term investment rather than the short-term projects. Projects tend to be very short, that a few years, several years, but we need a long-term commitment to really train younger generations for the capacities. And there is also mechanisms like a center for excellence in the Africas, and we need something more. And this needs also a commitment from like other countries. Then I think for the NDCs that there is a project financing, but often it's not so much enough domestically. So I think it would be good that if we can co-finance internationally, and also maybe co-financing across one countries, so that the implementation can go like not only one country but the basin scale. That's what I just mentioned before, the issue of the transboundary. So there's sort of we need a flexible finance mechanism. And I think also pointed out already, but lack of data is a big issue. But this is also related to that we need sort of future projections that Africans, we need a lot of like information for how the water resource is going to be. It's impacted by climate change hugely, especially in the monsoon in the East Africa. It's very, very uncertain areas. So I think in that sense, I think we need also improvement in like uptaking technologies, and also new way to like sharing knowledge. Community of practice can be also a good way to share the knowledge among different sectors. So yeah, sorry, I was a bit mixing up, like combining like issue and the solution. Just try to be a bit highlighting one topic, but I think I see a lot of like same issue that already pointed out, Flo. So it was very interesting, discussion.
Excellent summary. I was really struck by a number of patterns that are especially, I think, in contrast with the SIDS, that with of course larger countries, that actually transboundary issues become extremely important, and that the financing in particular may be a kind of limitation, that the financing may be more project focused, maybe not basin aware, and often we may need to think about almost portfolios of projects that can extend across political boundaries across a whole basin in a more coordinated fashion. I also really like the point that you made about how that the countries are already they're paying for a lot of things now, but that they've identified some capacity needs. You mentioned some around data, risk assessment methodologies, about maybe systems for sharing information, building capacity maybe more generally, and that may be a special set of roles that international or donor finance may be able to particularly help with, that kind of something extra that needs to be added to the system. And I also thought, I think your phrase for it was flexible financing. And I think that actually goes very well from a climate perspective, that there's so much uncertainty that we face right now that we may need some kind of contingency financing for novel situations that may be occurring, such as a really large storm, two storms that hit southern Africa recently. The issue around hydro, I thought, was something that jumped out as well. It actually, I think, related to Martin's intervention, that often we have older infrastructure. In Zimbabwe, for instance, the Zambezi is a shared hydropower resource with aging hydropower that is actually diminishing in its capacity directly because of climate change. And it's stressing all the regional hydropower to overproduce, to overcompensate for that work. And the ultimate effect is that it's all going to probably end up being used at an accelerated rate. So how do we move beyond that? How do we think about the next generation of new energy resources and replacement energy resources in the African context that gives us the carbon benefit, but is also adaptive to emerging risks? So a very interesting set of observations. So what I'd like to do now is maybe turn this to the broader discussion, really open it up to the rest of you. And I like very much Danny's question that Martin quoted. How can we help? And I would say we, in this case, is both the water community and the climate community together. How can we help one another? So this is in this part, if we could pretend like we're all on the same level, that there's not people up high on the podium. Comments or reflections?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer.
Wanted to say something? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought.
Well, there was one additional thing that struck me in the discussion with SIDS, but during the day. I mean, that one of the effects of the impact of climate change seems to be that countries see the need to revisit their water policies. So whether they are still effective in the new context. And I think there is a lot of collective knowledge in the water sector to actually help with that and say, okay, if this is your current policy and this is what you're confronted with, that doesn't seem to work anymore. Maybe we can give you examples of other policies that might help fill that new gap. So I think that's definitely something more at the policy level and in general that could help. And what also triggered me is that actually the impact of climate change actually forces rethinking of investments in the water sector. We all know that we have old infrastructure, and that's true for the SIDS, but it's also true for Europe. Most of it dates back to 50s or even older. Some of it goes back and on the Caribbean islands to the 19th century. And that it actually sort of triggers that they have to invest in renovating their old infrastructure. And I think that could be, one could be that maybe the climate finance people are willing to help with that, because part of it is an impact of climate change. I mean, it wasn't causing it, but it makes it worse. And the other side is that the water experts could actually help with designing good renovations that are climate resilient. So I think there is big opportunities there. And of course the hydropower issue. I mean, on the one hand, it is one of the alternatives for fossil fuel. But we also know that if you don't do it well, the negative impact on water resources can be huge. But making sure that initiatives like the Hydropower Sustainability Protocol are actually used, so advocate for designers and owners and countries to actually start using this kind of tools. And I think there, as a community, we can also play a role in actually making people aware that these tools exist. Because a lot of them don't even know that the water stewardship standard exists, that the hydropower protocol exists, that we have different instruments for measuring risks in basins, etc., etc. There's loads of tools out there, but most of the people don't even know that they're there, and they might need a little bit of help in learning how to apply them. So that would be another suggestion I would have, which could mutually be beneficial to both communities.
One of the statements that struck me was that, from the country reports from Zimbabwe and Angola, that the NDCs are focused primarily on mitigation, and they're not enough sufficient importance has been given yet on adaptation. And so for developing countries, that is, of course, a very big concern, right? That not much has been done on reporting on adaptation or adaptation plans. And the other thing is, it was identified also from the small island states. I mean, capacity is an issue, data is an issue. However, but there are organizations, as was also mentioned now, there are solutions available. There are organizations like mine who have the capacity to come up with scientific evidence, to come up with data, but the funding mechanism is, you have to go through the countries, and so I feel that's a big constraint. From our community, scientific community, to also provide this support to these countries, and then, and vice versa.
Thank you. Just in line of what Luna just highlighted, we have the same issue. In Angola, our NDC is majoritarily for the energy sector. But I think one of the biggest problems to produce a complete NDC on adaptation, or even to include a huge component of adaptation, is the difficulty to measure adaptation. When it comes to mitigation, we can easily say how much we will reduce on our emissions by the energy production. We can measure it easily. But when it comes to adaptation, countries still find difficult for that. I really think this is one of the reasons many countries don't have adaptation in its NDCs. When it comes to NAPS, it's a different thing. It's a thing of policies, program projects, and not you don't have to have numbers as you have to have on the NDCs. I think that's one of the reasons. Thank you.
I was just going to add, because I was in the SIDS group, that's exactly what they said, because they don't have adaptation. Specifically, Trinidad and Tobago does not have it specifically for that reason, because they believe their understanding of the process is that it's supposed to be about focused on mitigation, and that's where because you can quantify the results, and so with adaptation, it's so much harder to have those quantifiable. So because it's their feeling, because they have to report out on the NDCs, and so in that reporting, it's very difficult for them. So exactly as you say.
To complement this topic, that is very hard to evaluate adaptation. In the scientific committee that we have now in Chile, one of the tasks of our objectives is to trying to create some adaptation, some measurements, to measure some indexes to measure how effective adaptation measurements are. That will be one of our tasks, and that is one of the big results that we expect to get.
Excellent. It's a very tangible solution.
A lot of work has been done on indicators and measurement for SDG 13. And SDG 13 is typically much more adaptation-oriented than mitigation-oriented. And I think there are quite a lot of good suggestions in that set of indicators and monitoring system that could help, on the other side, the numbers for the Paris Agreement. There's no point in reinventing the wheel. And a lot of organizations there have done some really good stuff. And I'm quite sure if you would ask the custodian agencies for SDG 13 if they're willing to have a conversation with you on that, they're quite happy to do that.
Yeah, thanks, John. Well, I just want to make one remark for the organizers of this meeting today. There's a connection in the date on the SDG 13, which is on climate change, and the SDG 6, which is on the water and sanitation. And today is the 13th of June, which is the 13th of 6, and then the addition is 19. The total is the two aims. So that is a remark. The point that I want to make is, and I want to specify on what we have worked on our last session, is I think that what we need is something like a global climate action fund or security fund. In order to be, first of all, to raise awareness on climate risks that we might not see. If we have a flooding, we see that. If we have bacteria spreading, we don't see that. So I think, or fungus, and so forth. And that is something that has an enormous effect on climate and has an enormous effect on water. So I think that this needs to be done. As I said in the previous session, in the case of Zimbabwe with the fungus development within a couple of days, they lost the bumper harvest, right? So we need money in order to prevent the decay that is causing huge problems on the climate side as an effect. Thanks.
I just wanted to echo something that I heard this morning, but that was not brought forth in this discussion, and that is not to create more problems, but the disconnect that exists between the national level and the local level. And I think that that's extremely important in actually bringing those 1% solutions together to actually create the momentum that's needed on a grand scale. And so I don't have a solution for that, but maybe if we all think about that together, what can be particularly helpful in that space, I think that would be worth investing in or some thought and energy about.
One of my questions, I think, to be very timely, we are in Bonn. I was at the UNFCCC office in Bonn yesterday, and they had the registration desk set up for SB50 already. What can we do in the next week with SB50? What would be important, relevant, useful over that time scale? That there is it's a between COP a climate policy meeting that's happening this week, and so I'm sure that some of you are in this room because you're attending that meeting. How can we begin to set the agenda in preparation for the next COP about how to bring these two communities together, how to solve some of the issues that we have identified, how to implement some of the solutions that we've also found?
I think, John, the most important thing is to make the connection between water and climate, to make that obvious. And that is also the process that we started in Marrakesh to bring water to the table, right? So because before it was not regarded as important in the climate change discussion. But I think we can identify through agriculture, because 70% of the water goes into agriculture, and that is connected to energy. 20% of the water that we are, 20% of the electricity that we generate goes into pumping of water. So if we can reduce the decay of products, if we can do agriculture more efficient, if we use water more efficiently, we have a direct connection to climate change, and the numbers are big. Agriculture has the biggest impact. So if we look at that, we have the direct connection between the both, and that's what I think we need to bring to the table, because right now all the others, electricity, energy, and so forth, they don't see water as on the same level as they are, but I think we're even higher than that.
That's a perfect segue to make a plug for something that is happening next week. As part of the SB, there's these technical expert meetings, both on adaptation and mitigation. And the one on mitigation this year is focused on exactly that, water and energy in the agri-food chain. So there'll be a bunch of people that I think it's Jennifer, Thursday and Friday of the first week of the SB. So if any of you are sticking around for the meetings, I'll be there. Jennifer from CIWI will be there, and a bunch of others talking to a variety of different experts on exactly this issue of integration. Also happening, I mean, they're on the similar topic of agriculture, and how water fits into that at not this last COP, but the previous COP. The Cornivia joint work on agriculture was ratified or certified. And so they're holding their first series of workshops starting at the SB. And water is specifically included in there as well. So you know, coming from Marrakesh, where we didn't have a voice up until now, we're starting to have more of a voice. You know, we have a long way to go, but also being positive that we have made inroads, and specifically a lot of people in this room who've been working on these issues over the last 5 years.
Cecilia, please.
John, thank you. I might say that even with your translation, I'm still confused, because if we see water is there under the discussion, but because as Ingrid just focused on agriculture, you have it. You don't have agriculture without water. I mean, coastal areas. Countries are developing projects, adaptation projects, including water. But the thing is that there is, I don't see the focus. I mean, there is no focus on water as an agenda item, for example, if I can place like this. So my question is, will it happen? Because we are seeing now even ocean coming to climate change, biodiversity coming to climate change. Do we want to make only one agenda, or we want those items to be agenda items of climate change? I think we should reflect on the strategy of what exactly we want water to be on climate change, because it is there. For energy production, there is water. For everything, and just it's not specific like water. I mean, it's the biggest or the major ingredient is there, but it's not being considered as we wish it to be. So I really don't know how we will push for that. Like for the next week will be quite difficult. Yeah.
Well, then maybe for the COP or a longer term cycle, what would be maybe a more effective route or pathway? I mean, I think your intervention it feels very heartfelt to me, that you see that there's water is there, but it's not there enough. It's not there effectively in the right form. And how do we get to fill that gap? I think that's the question that we're talking about. If it's not this week, then is it over the next 5 COPs?
I have an idea, a proposal. I don't know. I think we can start, or you can start like assessing programs from countries, and with what the number of projects, including water on it, and I don't know, create numbers to reflect that water is so much there that needs more attention. Because I don't see in another way it coming. Even at national level, you don't see this relevance, because we have water. We need water at home for everything, so it's there. It's something that it's there, but we are not paying attention on that. So to this forum, International Forum of Climate Change, you have to have numbers, I think. You have to have statistics on how many projects are there being approved, being implemented, and is related with water. So maybe it's a starting point. I don't know. It's just an idea, and we can develop on that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dieter.
Yeah, Cecilia, I think there are the numbers, when you bring them and you add them up, you will see it has a tremendous effect. But water is not sexy, okay? And that is, like the climate change has Greta, okay? Since Katowice, she is aware. She is bringing awareness to the topic. On the water side, we don't have that. One of the biggest issue is water quality. Everybody's talking about plastic bottles and bottled water, right? But actually, it's a problem of water quality. We are not sure about the water quality. If we take a water is coming into a water treatment plant. We take a sample of this water, we put it in the laboratory. 1 or 2 weeks later, we get the result of the water. Analyze all the data that we need. But this water has been drunk already when we get the results. Not knowing what the results are. We just take it for granted because we have done so 100 years ago, right? But the problem is actually we don't know the results of the quality of the water. Therefore, lots of people drink bottled water. This bottled water is causing a problem because 7.5 to 15 billion bottles of plastic are produced every day and going wherever. So producing lots of waste. Lots of money goes into the problem of plastic, but doesn't go into the water quality issue. So actually we have to raise awareness that there is a connection between the problems and the solution is at the water side. And that is what I think we bring to the table. And we need a Greta for the water part.
Please, Martin.
Yes. Hello? I would also come back to the question, like, what can we do in SB50 and later? When I talk to the climate change colleagues at GIZ and at BMZ, and when they are honest colleagues, like Daniela, but for climate change, the first reaction is, what do you guys complain about? 51% of adaptation finance is in the water sector. So why are you always saying water is not an issue for climate finance? It's true, it's not part of the Paris Agreement. It's not mentioned there. Food security is mentioned. There are some political reasons, and we can always go on. It seems like sometimes it happens. These issues sometimes happen accidentally somehow because somebody knows somebody. I'm not really sure how it happens, but we must be humble and know the figures. We must know that we are still at the international level, even though the latest climate policy initiative report is from 2017. So I hope it will be updated soon. But we are still the largest adaptation sector. And the second thing they say, you can even watch a Twitter video by Frank Fasmetz, who is the BMZ guy representing his ministry for Germany at the Green Climate Fund, and he says we so often get water proposals which have nothing to do with climate change, and this whole climate rational story, which was mentioned before here in the morning, is still an issue. And to be honest, it's an issue since 2010. So I think as a community, we have the right to be very proud of what we achieved as a water community. And I'm a water guy myself. I know water is the solution to climate change and many other issues. Water resources management and other natural resources management. We just have to be a little careful, I think, when we talk to climate change people and also to other sectors. Maybe what we can do now is do the same what you guys did when you established the Climate is Water initiative. Think, what are our key messages? Maybe there's something we overlooked in the last COP and I think in the last COP we had a side event on wetlands and we discussed the fact that wetlands store twice as much carbon as forests. So there might be some potential in that area, or maybe we can talk about water storage as a solution, including hydrological big dams and facilities, but also groundwater as storage and small decentralized storage solutions. So we should come together as a community again, like we do today, and agree on some key messages and share these with the donors in a very climate-ready way.
I like that message very much. If I could summarize some of the thoughts that I've heard, one interpretation I think from the climate community about water people, I certainly consider myself a water person as well, is that we have a really bad attitude. I was at the World Water Forum in Korea a few years ago, and I knew that I had a meeting later that day with the climate champion from France. This was in the run-up to the Paris Agreement, and I'd never met him before, and so I went to the Adaptation Fund website, and I did kind of a quick accounting of all the projects that how many of them and what it represented in terms of U.S. dollars that were water related, but that were not labeled as water projects. And when I met with him, I said, look just at this, out of a 300 million, about 280, 270 are actually water projects. And he said, what are you complaining about? So effectively, why do you have such a bad attitude? And I was really kind of nonplussed by that. And I realized kind of two things. One was that I didn't really mean just water. I really meant resilient water management practices. That's a narrower category, and even in the water community, there's really not that many people who are doing it. And that's a problem that we need to take care of ourselves. We're not really managing in most places water in a resilient way already. So for us to go to the climate community and say, you need to do more of these projects, we haven't taken care of our own house. The other is that we need to actually, communicate ourselves as a solution to their problems. I think your example about forests is really good. What did the red people really accomplish? They taught the world to look at a tree and see long strands of carbon. We need to maybe be able to look at trees and see water molecules, to see fields of cotton, or to see a light bulb and see the water molecules that are embedded inside of it. And I think that's a very powerful communication and enabling, hopefully a humble approach too, that makes it not seem like we have a terrible attitude. I also, I think that the role of finance has come up over and over again. And maybe there's this nice phrase in English, where is the smart money? A lot of our finance has not been smart money. And especially in the two regional sessions, I think that the cri de coeur that I really heard in both cases, we have specific needs, and no one is really helping us with those. And it's not probably a lot of money, but it's some, and it's for very particular problems. They're kind of transitional problems. We get it for a short time. I mean, I think actually in the Africa session, Cecilia, I heard you say it really well. We're using consultants right now, but we're trying to build a system so we don't need consultants. We're just using Angola-trained, Angola-oriented experts. That's what we want to build. We want to own this problem. That's what I heard you saying. I was very moved by that. And that kind of smart money that's going to these very targeted needs, it seems like a significant gap. Instead of trying to say, here's this existing portfolio of projects that we've had on the shelf for the past 20 years, and please, Alistair, can you pay for them? So that maybe the last aspect is my personal sense. I just came from a workshop in Southern Africa where I was working with UNESCO and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Deltatus, a few other groups, working with a huge range of Southern Africa, 40, 50 people. And we're talking about risk assessment and risk reduction approaches, all related to water. Very technical, but very applied. And I was really struck, again, with this theme about measuring things. That we're not, in the water community, we're not that good, really, about being able to measure things. There's a colleague at the WMO, he says, you can't manage what you can't measure. I'm actually not sure that that's true, but I would say you can't finance what you can't measure. And that actually may be more important. And that there are things that we need to be able to measure risk. We need to be able to measure threats in a way. And that is something, again, that the water community needs to take care of itself. So with that, I'd really like it if you could give a very warm round of thanks to our rapporteurs, including our missing rapporteur. And to all the speakers and yourself for what I think was a very warm and productive day. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to Danny and to the rest of the World Water Council for hosting this.